go ahead.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or to change a vote? If not on this vote, the yeas are 100 and the nays are 0. The amendment is agreed to.
Amendment final to reads once you get there.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
If I could have the attention of the Senate.
The Majority Leader speaking to the Senate. We have order.
Mr. President, if we have this consent agreement that I'm going to ask in just a second, we will have 4 votes remaining for the evening, and that would be all. We'll be in session tomorrow. We have some things we need to do procedurally, but there shouldn't be any votes tomorrow. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that upon disposition of S-1867, the defense bill, the Senate proceed to vote on the Reid of Nevada motion to proceed to calendar number 238, S-1917, that there be 2 minutes equally divided between the 2 leaders or the designees prior to the vote. That upon disposition of the Reid motion to proceed, it be in order for the Republican leader or his designee to move to proceed to calendar number 244, S-1931. There are 2 minutes of debate equally divided between the 2 leaders or the designees prior to the vote, that both motions to proceed be subject to a 60-vote affirmative vote threshold. Finally, that the motion, cloture motion relative to the motion to proceed S-1917 be vitiated.
Is there objection? Is there objection? Without objection. So ordered. No. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on Amendment 1209, offered by the Senator from Florida, Mr. Nelson.
That one.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, it's my understanding that that both leaders have decided to accept this, so I don't see any need for a roll call vote.
We're with you.
Is all time yielded back?
Our time's yielded back.
Question occurs on the amendment. Hearing no further debate. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Amendment is agreed to.
You want to lay on the table?
We'll lay on the table.
Without objection.
Here's the order that they're going.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided, prior to a vote on amendment number 1080.
Put in a quorum call until he gets here.
Offered by the Senator from Vermont, Mr. Leahy.
Senator Leahy authorized me and told me that he was withdrawing this amendment relative to military custody because of all of the actions which have previously been taken, and I am very confident that that's what he told me. So I'm going to withdraw that amendment on his behalf.
Without objection, amendment is withdrawn. Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on amendment number 1274 offered by the Senator from Alabama, Mr. Sessions.
Mr. President, this
Senator from Alabama.
This amendment is crafted to simply clarify and affirm what appears to be the law, and logic tells us should be the law today. If an individual is apprehended as a prisoner of war, they are detained under the laws of war until the conflict ends. But if after being detained or when they're detained it's determined they have committed crimes against the laws of war, they can be tried for those crimes. There is a slight ambiguity. I think it's pretty clear that that they have a right, the military would have a right to continue to detain them as a prisoner of war if they were not convicted of the much higher burden crime against the laws of war. So the essence of this is simply to say what the judge said in the case involving the African embassy bomb in the Galani case. The guy was acquitted.
Senator's time has expired.
284 out of 285 counts, and the judge said you probably still would be detained under the laws of war. So this would clarify that.
Who yields time?
Mr. President, I think that this can be accepted on a voice vote. I have great problems with it, but I think there's probably a majority here that will favor it, and a distinct minority perhaps that would not, but it is something which basically doesn't add to the existing law, which says that this is theoretically possible. And all this does is say it is possible that one can be acquitted of in a criminal case and still be held as an enemy combatant. And that we can try to we could.
For the yeas and nays. Is there sufficient second? Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckich. Oh, sorry, he got me right. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss.
Waiting on number 10, meeting was withdrawn.
No, you are actually Senator. There's
Mr. Coates.
actually,
Mr. Coburn.
there's another lady.
Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. No Way. Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Carey, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer,
That's what we did. That's what we just did. Yeah. Maybe create
Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoban, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lieberman, Manchin, Moran, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Levin. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Beckidge, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Carper, Conrad, Coons, Corker, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Johnson of South Dakota, Carey, Kirk, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lee, Levin, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson, Nebraska, Paul, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Colorado, Udall, New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Noe, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Snow? Ms. Snow, no. Mrs. Hutcherson, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Lugar, aye.
McConnell.
Mr. McConnell, aye.
Cornyn.
Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Where? Mr. McKay, no.
And Cantwell, too.
Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Coates?
Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or to change a vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 41, the nays are 59. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
we do not have order in the Senate.
Senate will come to order. Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, we have too many conversations still going.
Will senators who are having conversations in the well please take them off the floor?
Mr. President, the next roll call vote. Mr. President, the next roll call vote will be the 9,000th vote cast by Senator Frank Lautenberg. Senator Lautenberg, the senior senator from New Jersey, has really always been a fighter for his state, for progressive causes. Before coming to the Senate, Senator Lautenberg served his country admirably in World War II, graduated from Columbia Business School, and became, and this is an understatement, a successful businessman. The determination that made him successful in the private sector has served him well in the Senate, where he worked tirelessly on behalf of the state of New Jersey.
Love you, Frank.
Frank really tried to retire once in 2000, but really he just couldn't stay away from serving the state and this nation, and returned to the Senate a little over a year after he had retired. As a top Democrat on the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Lautenberg negotiated the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which restored fiscal discipline while cutting taxes for students and families with children. He's been at the cutting edge of environmental issues in this country since he came to the Senate. He's worked for I'm a member of the Public Works Committee, Environment Committee, for doing good jobs with highways, railways, runways in New Jersey, and he's done that in conjunction to being a member of the Public Works Committee, but also the Appropriations Committee. But during his time in the Senate, he's done things that will be a lasting mark on his career, his legacy, forever. Our nation's roads are safer because he was responsible for our passing the 21-year-old drinking age. He established a national drunk driving standard, which was so important to have a standard throughout the country. He banned triple-trailer trucks, the so-called killer trucks, from the roads of New Jersey and other states. And he's dedicated his time in the Senate to holding terrorists accountable and protecting New Jersey's ports, which are important to all of us, not only the people of New Jersey. Senator Lautenberg has done many things. He's authored the domestic violence gun ban, the only significant gun legislation to become law since the Brady Bill, which prevents convicted abusers from buying guns. The thing that I've recognized very importantly, I had one of my boys who just couldn't stand the cigarette smoke in airplanes. And even though the airlines tried to set up a standard for smoking, you know, if you smoked in an airplane, the fact that you were someplace else in the airplane, everybody got this secondhand smoke. He fought this and banned smoking on airplanes, which I'll always remember, and certainly my boy Key will always remember that. So for 3 decades, Frank Lautenberg has left a mark that's very impressive, and his 9,000 votes have been something that people will look back and historically determine that Frank Lautenberg has been one of the most productive senators in the history of our country. Congratulations, Frank.
Mr. President, Republican Leader.
I'd just like to associate myself with the remarks of the Majority Leader and congratulate the Senator from New Jersey on this milestone in his long and very distinguished career here in the Senate.
All right, Frank.
Mr. President. Senator from New Jersey. Mr. President, I know we want to hear from our colleagues shortly. I just want to join in recognizing over a quarter of a century of distinguished service from the senior senator from New Jersey on this 9,000th vote, which is only emblematic of the type of work that he has done, which is a view not towards the next election, but the next generation. Whether it is saving lives by raising the drinking age, whether it is allowing workers to understand and have the right to know the toxic chemicals they were working with and the community in which those toxic chemicals were located, whether it is making sure that all of us didn't have to breathe secondhand smoke on an airplane, whether it is making sure that those who pilfered the land and contaminated it were held responsible to clean it up in Superfund, or to have cleaner air to breathe. Frank Lautenberg's legislation has touched millions of lives, not only in New Jersey, but across the nation. And we salute him for his tremendous service.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Senior
Leader.
Senator from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Leader, and for your kind words and the help that you have given me to make some of the decisions that we labored with. My colleague, Bob Menendez, who has worked very hard to do his share in moving legislation and doing the right thing by the people in our state and our country. And one of the things that is, to me, pretty important was when I said to my mother in 1982, I said, Mom, I'm going to run for the United States Senate. I think there's an opportunity there. And I was running ADP, quite a good company at the time. And so she said, Frank, what do you need it for? I said, Mom, I don't need it. And the night of the election, we were gathered at my house in New Jersey, and my mother was then committed to a wheelchair, and she had tears running down her face. I said, Mom, you asked me why I needed it. So I said, why are you crying? She said, because I always wanted you to win. And
the people in New Jersey were very kind over these years, electing me 5 times to the Senate and giving me the honor and the opportunity to give something back to this country of ours. I came from a family that was a poor family, immigrant family. My parents were young when they were brought by their parents to America. They were hoping that maybe good things could happen as a result of our becoming Americans. And so I stand here and I'm glad, Mr. Leader, that we're not taking a vote on whether or not I should be commended for this. I might not get all the votes that you gave me because you didn't ask for unanimous consent, but nevertheless, it passed. So I thank all of you, even those with whom I might occasionally disagree. It's shocking, but it does happen here. But I have respect for everybody who's sent here by their constituents from every state in the country and for their point of view. Doesn't mean I agree. But I have respect for the fact that we can say what we want in this free country of ours, say things at sometimes maybe we wish we hadn't said, but we have a chance to speak out on the things that we believe in. So I thank all of you for your service and for the accolades given to me this night, Mr. Leader. And with that, I say I don't note the absence of a quorum. There's a quorum here now, and I thank all of you for being here.
All right, Frankie. Frankie.
There will be 2 minutes of debate on Leahy Amendment 1087. Who yields time?
And then before we vote, right here.
President.
Udall, hang
The
on.
Senator from Michigan.
This one's Udall. This one's Leahy.
Mr. President, I ask now consent that the pending Germain Leahy Amendment 1087 be modified with the changes that are at the desk. Further, that the amendment is modified be agreed to.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendment is modified. Senator from
Reserving the right to object, could the manager clarify exactly what that is?
Freedom of Information Act modification.
This was
Senator from Michigan.
there was a provision in the bill relative to the Freedom of Information Act, which by agreement was modified.
This doesn't have anything to do with the manager's package.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendment is modified. It's accepted. There will now be 2 minutes of debate on the Udall Amendment.
Okay, I now ask the Leahy Amendment was just agreed to. I ask move to reconsider.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I now ask.
Let him call up the next one.
There's a pending amendment which apparently the clerk would need to report at this point.
The Udall Amendment is pending.
I ask consent now, Mr. President, the pending Germain Udall, Senator Udall of New Mexico Amendment 1202 be modified with the changes that are at the desk. Further, that the amendment is modified be agreed to.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendment is modified as agreed to. Senator from New Mexico.
I would thank the chairman for working with me on this amendment, and I think he gave us a modification that's a good one. This amendment I'm offering with Senator Schumer and Senator Sanders closes the Buy American loopholes and applies Buy American requirements to solar projects that are funded by the Department of Defense to meet energy goals in this bill. If American taxpayer funds are used to improve our military bases' energy security, then American solar firms should have the ability to compete. We know that other nations like China are spending vast resources to become leaders in the solar power market. Think about it this way. China does not spend its tax dollars on U.S. solar panels at Chinese military bases. Why should Congress provide market access that is not extended?
Senator will suspend. Senate's not in order.
Regular order.
Senator from New Mexico.
Why should Congress provide
The
market
senator has
access?
used his 1 minute. Time has expired.
And I thank Senator McCain. I thank Senator Levin. I ask that my full statement be included in the record, and I appreciate their help on this amendment.
I yield the time.
The clerk will read the title of the bill as amended for the third time.
Calendar number 230, S. 1867, a bill to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2012 for military activities of the Department of Defense, for military construction, and for defense activities of the Department of Energy to prescribe military personnel strengths for such year and for other purposes.
There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided on the bill as amended.
Do you know the numbers?
We're going to be making a unanimous consent
Senator from
request.
Michigan.
I'm not going to even use my 1 minute on this other than to say thanks to everybody that has been so heavily involved in that, which is just about everybody in the Senate. I want to particularly thank Senator McCain and his staff. My staff has been utterly incredible. We've had hundreds of amendments we had to get through. We've done the best we can. And I want to just tell my friends this so we can prepare a path for unanimous consent agreement. It's not prepared yet, so I can't read it, but it's going to be something like this, that for those amendments which were germane, not because of modification, but were germane, and
I don't think we disposed of the Udall amendment.
I believe we did.
I would ask the chair.
The Udall amendment was agreed to.
It was agreed to. Okay, thank you. Pardon me.
Reluctantly.
Let me describe what this is about so we can at least be thinking about it before it's offered. There were 71 amendments approximately which were cleared. We spoke about those before. If anyone had an objection, they were not cleared. So by definition, there's no objection on the substance of these amendments. However, there is objection for other reasons. One of them being that if an amendment was modified to make it germane, there would be an objection on that basis. So what Senator McCain and I are talking about, and we'll put it in a unanimous consent proposal, and then you can all decide if you want to agree to this, is that we would we pass the bill tonight and do all the other things we need to do, because that has to be done. We've got to get to conference. But that in the next couple days, Senator McCain and I, working with the parliamentarian, would go through the 71 amendments, whatever the number is. The parliamentarian would advise us as to which of those amendments are germane and were germane, and these are all cleared amendments. And for that group, whatever the number is, that we're informed by the parliamentarian are germane and were germane, we would then put in a bill which would be introduced next week. And that if we can get it done, the unanimous consent request would have that bill introduced, read a third time, and passed. That would be the most we could ask for. But it would seem to me that if we could pass this tonight, we could do the same thing with a bill, providing Senator McCain and I agree, after talking to the parliamentarian, that the only amendments that would be in that bill would be amendments which were germane. Now, how do we get that bill into the conference report? We haven't figured that out yet, but we're working on that piece as well. But at least we could get the bill passed so we could go to conference and show that the Senate passed these X number of amendments. This is the best we could do. It's the cleanest that we can do. The parliamentarian did not like a different idea that we proposed, and I don't blame him and her. but that's what we're going to be offering in a few minutes.
I have nothing more to add. I'd like to vote.
Mr. President. Mr. President. Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, if I may be permitted to just thank the distinguished chairman for that offer. It's unclear to me how it actually will be executed, and all of this could have been avoided, from my perspective, if a simple unanimous consent request had been allowed to modify an amendment that I had that was not germane to make it germane, so we could have a simple up or down vote, something that was really in the nature of a technical correction, which I would think, as a matter of custom and courtesy, would be allowed. But apparently that's not the way things are operating. So all of these convolutions are being engaged in simply to avoid an objection caused by an objection to a unanimous consent request to modify a amendment to make it germane, and it could all be avoided, and we could have taken care of this in 10 or 15 minutes. But I don't understand that the distinguished chairman is actually making that unanimous consent request at this time, but merely explaining what his intentions are. We'll try to work with him but I'm not yet sure that this thing is going to work as he hopes it will, and my objection will remain that any amendment that was not germane when filed but could be made germane by modification, as mine could, would not be permitted to be in this manager's package or passed by unanimous consent.
Mr. President, let me just say.
Senator from Arizona.
It sounds simplistic, and the hour is late, and we need to vote, but the fact is there was 382 amendments that were submitted. There was hundreds of amendments that were waiting. And the fact is that initially that it was not, the Cornyn amendment was not agreed to. So it's a little more complicated than that. There was literally 400 or 500 amendments that were filed, and we had to, at some point, cut off the process. We will try to, for next year's bill, to get a situation where it's far more inclusive and far more informative, but when you're dealing with 500 bills, I know that each individual's bill is important, but there's no way you're going to be able to get through the authorization bill with that many amendments that are filed, and that's just a fact. And we are doing the best we can to accommodate the senator from Texas and the senator from Oklahoma and every other senator that didn't get their amendment voted on.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent that upon passage of S. 1867, the Armed Services Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1540 and the Senate proceed to its consideration. That all after the enacting clause be stricken and text of S. 1867 as amended and passed by the Senate be inserted in lieu thereof. That H.R. 1540 as amended be read a third time, passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the Chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, with the Armed Services Committee appointed as conferees, that no points of order be considered waived by virtue of this agreement, and all with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
All right, good. Thanks, Laura.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank everybody and thank the Chair.
The question is on passage of the bill as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus.
I want to vote with you. I'm voting with you, brother.
Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin.
Aye.
Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey.
Oh, you're talking about introducing
Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Yeah, did you have an interim? You understand. No, not.
Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Lieberman.
Oh, they got him on there.
Mr. Lugar.
The calendar.
I called my chief, the chief. He had two guys over there at 5 minutes.
Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Markley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran.
That's great. We've got to steer you in the right direction. Make sure you get.
Ms. Markowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Ayotte, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Corker, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Perk, Klobuchar, Cole, Kyle, Landrieu, Leahy, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Webb, Whitehouse, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Harkin, Lee, Hall, Sanders. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Levin,